Hello, welcome to our YouTube channel. Today we're joined by our centre researcher David Hearne. So David, the government has unveiled its blueprint for policing trade between different parts of the country after the post-Brexit transition period ends, and are now setting out which powers currently held by the EU it plans to take on and which will actually be given to devolved administrations. So what powers are expected to be given to certain countries and administrations then?
Well, the situation is a little bit more complicated than it appears at face value. The government have announced plans to devolve 157, I think, just off the top of my head, powers to Northern Ireland, most of which will be covered by the withdrawal agreement in any case, so they will have to adhere to existing EU regulations in most cases anyway. More interesting is Scotland, which, again, off the top of my head, I think receives 111 new powers, and Wales, which I think received about 70. The bigger challenge and the problem here is, what do you start to do in areas where those differing standards might affect the trade of goods and services across borders within the UK? Now, this is being presented by Westminster as sort of turbocharging, the devolved administration is giving them lots of extra powers. And it's being seen, particularly in Scotland, as a kind of Westminster power grab, taking away, things that we should have. I think the reality is that neither of those positions are entirely true, but it is definitely a challenge to see how you ensure frictionless trade within the UK, avoiding things like checks on animals or foodstuffs being transported between England and Scotland or England and Wales, whilst at the same time trying not to take powers away from the devolved administrations that, to be blunt, should lie with them. So I think in some sense that's quite complex. From the SNP's perspective, obviously, if you're in favour of independence, then anything short of absolute control and absolute autonomy over your own powers is by definition something that you'd seek to oppose. But again, I think that's quite nuanced, and I think that there's great similarities there over the Brexit debate. Take back control. We want sovereignty. We want power, and I think it's really, really interesting to think about how that affects everyone concerned in the modern world.
So, manufacturing lobby group Make UK have warned Boris Johnson that former Red Wall seats won by the Tories in last year's election would be at most risk of severe economic damage from Brexit talks collapsing. So, can you remind us where these seats were won then, and why these areas in particular could be the hardest affected?
So, a number of these seats are seats that have been Labour voting for many, many years. They're traditionally poorer than average across the UK. They tend to be areas that have seen their relative position erode as well. And they're often areas that are demographically much more along the lines of Labour voters as they looked 30 or 40 years ago, rather than Labour voters as they perhaps look now. The modern Labour Party being very strong in kind of cosmopolitan urban areas and much weaker in sort of the hinterlands. So you've got places like West Bromwich, where it was a shock to see both of those seats go to the Conservative Party. Further north, you've got all sorts of areas, even Tony Blair's old seat, for goodness sake, Sedgefield, swung. So you've got a number of places across the country, particularly in the Midlands and the North, that swung to those areas. I'm not sure that we have enough data to actually talk too confidently on the make it pronouncement. I think the situation is a little bit more complicated than that, in that we do know that a lot of the areas in which those seats are situated, like larger areas within which those seats are particularly exposed to European trade. What we don't know is whether those particular seats and the industries located in those particular seats are actually exposed. So it might well be that the very high levels of exposure, and you can think of firms across the West Midlands, perhaps in automotive, that are very exposed to this. They might not be located in, let's say, West Bromwich East.
And UK companies are stockpiling ahead of Brexit and a potential cliff edge, because, of course, if no agreement is ratified this year, then the UK and EU will trade on WTO terms. So what industries are stockpiling at the moment and planning in most in advance then?
I think a lot of people don't realise exactly what trading on WTO rules would look like. It would be a very, very, very severe break. And there's only so much you can do in terms of stockpiling. So I would caution that, particularly if you export or you rely on your certification from things like the European Chemicals Agency, etc., then there are real issues there that need to much wider than stockpiling that need to be resolved. In terms of stockpiling, I think the usual culprits we see here. Again, automotive, it makes total sense to try and get stuff into the country, although to be honest, there's a limit to what's feasible just due to size. You know, you'd need to warehouse vast amounts, so there's not much that's possible, but we'll see a little bit of that, I think, for smaller items. More generally, I think areas like retail and wholesale will start to be stocking up. Goods that are relatively easy to keep, then that's possible, and people will be buying warehousing capacity for those. The challenge is with chilled foods that go off very quickly, and I'm not really sure what you can do about that. You know, long-term stockpiling just isn't the solution there. So I think it will be very interesting to see what happens.
Thanks for joining us, David.
Thank you.